All right, so get this. Today's deep dive, we're going right to the edge, right to the brink. Nuclear war, the Cuban Missile Crisis. You sent over these excerpts from Wikipedia, and wow, this isn't just some dry history lesson here. This is 13 days where really the fate of the world was hanging by a thread.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And to really understand it, I think we need to kind of go beyond just the what happened and really dig into the why, right? Like
Right.
what was going on behind the scenes? What were the motivations? What were the missteps? And yeah, I think we might even uncover a few surprises along the way.
Okay, so the excerpts you shared mentioned, obviously, the Cold War, like
Mm.
that's the backdrop here. But this wasn't just about, the U.S. and the Soviets, like
Mm.
facing off, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the Cold War was this global chess match, but this particular game, this was also about Cuba, right? And
Yeah.
their fight for autonomy.
Right.
Remember, this is just a few years after the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro is in charge, and he's staring down a superpower basically in his own backyard.
And that, I mean, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in '61, that definitely didn't help things.
Oh no, that was major. Yeah, that was a major turning point. You have this U.S.-backed attempt to overthrow Castro, and it backfires spectacularly. So imagine the distrust that created not just between Cuba and the U.S., but also between Cuba and the Soviets, right? Because from their perspective, it looked like the U.S. was like dead set on taking down this communist regime.
Yeah. It's like they lit a fuse with that Bay of Pigs fiasco, and the tension just keeps ratcheting up from there.
Exactly. And then on top of all that, we have to factor in something that I think often gets left out of the story, which is that the US, they had actually placed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy
Really?
before the Soviets even thought about Cuba.
Wait, so the U.S. made the first move in this high stakes game.
In a way, yes. I mean, put yourself in Khrushchev's shoes for a second, right? You're looking at a map and you've got US missiles practically on your doorstep in Turkey. This wasn't just a Cuban problem anymore. This was the US bringing the Cold War right to the USSR's backyard.
So he felt like he had to respond. He had to like protect Soviet interests.
Exactly. Deploying missiles to Cuba, in his mind, this was about leveling the playing field. It was a dangerous game of brinksmanship for sure, but that was the reality of the Cold War, right? Each side was trying to outmaneuver the other, but with this very real threat of, nuclear annihilation looming over everything.
Okay, so let's talk about the players in this global standoff. Obviously, you've got Kennedy and Khrushchev, but the excerpts mention some other names too. Who are these other figures who are kind of caught in the middle of this pressure cooker?
Well, you've got Fidel Castro, of course, determined to safeguard the Cuban Revolution. Then you've got Che Guevara, already a revolutionary icon at this point. But then we get to these lesser-known individuals, people like Rudolf Anderson, the U-2 pilot who was shot down over Cuba,
Oh, right.
and Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet submarine officer. And these are people who were thrust into situations where, I mean, their decisions could have meant the difference between, peace and nuclear war.
It's like their stories. It really puts a human face on this massive global event, because it's easy to forget that behind all the politics, behind all the maneuvering, there were real people whose lives were on the line.
Absolutely. And each player had their own perspective, their own anxieties, their own goals. I mean, Castro, he was trying to protect his revolution, right?
Right.
Khrushchev wanted to bolster Soviet standing on the world stage. And Kennedy, he was trying to navigate this impossible path between appearing weak on one hand and, potentially stumbling into a nuclear war that no one could win on the other.
Talk about a no-win situation, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, the Soviets they've sent missiles to Cuba. How does the U.S. even find out about it? Like, how does this even come on their radar?
Well, the excerpts talk about the role of the U-2 spy planes.
Right.
You know those. So imagine being the analyst who's looking at those photographs, right? And they start to see these telltale signs, the missile erectors, the launch sites. It must have been a heart-stopping moment realizing what they were looking at.
Talk about a needle in a haystack. Except in this case, the needle could destroy the entire world.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. And what's even crazier is there was actually a period of several weeks where the U.S. had temporarily stopped U-2 flights over Cuba.
Why?
Because of diplomatic incidents with the Soviet Union and China. They called it the photo gap. Can you imagine weeks where they were essentially flying blind?
I'm getting anxious just thinking about it. All right, so the U.S. has proof now. They have the photographs. There are Soviet missiles in Cuba. What happens next?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. So Kennedy convenes this group, this top secret group called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM for short.
Yeah.
And they have to decide what to do. And you can bet there were some pretty heated discussions happening in that room.
Oh, I bet. I bet. What were they even considering at that point?
I mean, everything was on the table, right?
Right.
Some advisors, they wanted to take a hard line. They were arguing for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Others thought maybe a surgical airstrike, just target the missile sites. That might be enough.
Right.
Can you imagine the weight of those decisions?
It's almost too much to even contemplate. So what did Kennedy decide? What did they land on? I mean, a full-on invasion, that would have been incredibly risky.
It would have been a gamble of epic proportions.
Yeah.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were all for it. They were convinced that the Soviets, they wouldn't risk a nuclear war over Cuba. But Kennedy, he wasn't so sure. He was worried about pushing Khrushchev too far and triggering a wider conflict. And let's not forget, invading Cuba, that would make the U.S. look like the aggressor on the world stage.
Right, yeah. So if an invasion was off the table, what other options did they have?
Well, they decided on what they called a quarantine of Cuba.
A quarantine.
Now, that might sound like a strange term for a military action, right?
It does sound a bit medical when you put it like that.
That was entirely intentional. They avoided using the term blockade because a blockade, that's technically an act of war.
Oh, okay.
So they wanted to send a strong message to Moscow, but maintain, a degree of control over the situation.
Right. So what exactly did this quarantine entail? I'm guessing it wasn't about like face masks and social distancing.
Not quite.
Either.
Essentially, Kennedy announced to the world that the U.S. Navy would prevent Soviet ships carrying offensive weapons from reaching Cuba. They basically drew a line in the water and dared Khrushchev to cross it.
Okay, now that is tense. I bet the entire world was holding its breath at that point. Like, what was the reaction like from other countries?
Well, Kennedy did reach out to, key allies like the UK and Canada before going public, and they were mostly on board. But you can imagine the reaction from other world leaders was, a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Some were supportive, others condemned the U.S. actions, and everyone was on edge, waiting to see what Khrushchev would do next.
Talk about a cliffhanger. So the U.S. Navy's like drawing a line in the water. Khrushchev's got to be fuming. The rest of the world is like watching this whole thing unfold. What happens next?
Well, behind the scenes, things were just as tense. In fact, this is where we get to one of the most, I think, intriguing details from these excerpts. It involves this secret lunch between an American journalist named John Scully and get this, a KGB agent.
Oh.
Alexander Fomin.
Hold on. A journalist and a KGB agent. That
Yeah.
sounds more like a scene from a spy movie than real life.
It really does. And what's fascinating is that this wasn't just like a casual encounter. Fomin, he was acting on orders from the Soviet Politburo.
Oh.
That's their highest governing body, right?
Right.
And they used this lunch meeting to basically float the idea of a diplomatic solution.
So even as tensions are like escalating, there's these like secret talks going on in the background. What were they even proposing at that point?
Well, Fomin, he suggested that the Soviets, they would be willing to remove the missiles from Cuba.
Oh.
They would even allow the UN to oversee the process, to guarantee their sincerity.
Okay, that sounds promising. What was the catch?
The catch was that in return, the U.S. would have to publicly promise not to invade Cuba.
Right.
Which, makes sense.
Okay.
From the Soviet and Cuban perspective, that was their biggest fear all along.
Yeah. No, totally. It's like this high stakes negotiation. Only the fate of literally the fate of the world is hanging in the balance. But even with these back channels open, situation kept escalating, didn't it?
It did. And remember, this is all happening under this veil of secrecy, right? Publicly, both sides were still locked in this very dangerous standoff. In fact, the U.S. actually raised its military alert level to DEFCON 2.
DEFCON 2. Okay, for those of us who aren't fluent in Cold War military jargon, what does that actually mean?
DEFCON 2 is just one step away from nuclear war.
Oh, wow.
It means that the U.S. military was on high alert, ready to respond to a Soviet attack, at a moment's notice. Think B-52 bombers, loaded with nuclear weapons, on continuous airborne alert, just waiting for the order. It's chilling to think how close we actually came.
And then on top of all of this, a U.S. U-2 spy plane, it gets shot down over Cuba. That must have been the breaking point, right? Did Kennedy order like a retaliatory strike?
He was under immense pressure to do exactly that.
Yeah.
Many of his advisors, they saw this as a blatant act of aggression, a justification for war.
Yeah. I can't even imagine what was going through his mind at that moment.
Yeah, the weight of the world was on his shoulders, but to everyone's surprise, he held back.
Wow.
He knew that a single act of retaliation could spiral into, a full-blown nuclear exchange.
Incredible restraint. So what happened? How do they finally break this cycle of escalation?
Well, on the same day the U-2 was shot down, Khrushchev sent another message to Kennedy. This time, he laid out a more concrete proposal. The Soviets, they would dismantle their missiles in Cuba under UN supervision in exchange for a U.S. pledge, a guarantee that they would not invade Cuba.
Okay, so that sounds similar to what they were suggesting through those back channels. So they were finally ready to make a deal.
Yes, but there was one more crucial detail.
What's that?
Khrushchev also demanded that the U.S. remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey.
Remember those missiles we talked about earlier?
Right.
The ones that had Khrushchev so on edge?
Right.
This was his chance to get them out of his backyard.
So the removal of the U.S. missiles from Turkey, that was the real sticking point. What was Kennedy's response?
It was a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
The ex-com was divided. Some saw it as a concession. It would weaken NATO, make the U.S. look weak. But Kennedy, influenced by his brother Robert, who was also, conducting these secret negotiations, he saw a way out.
Okay.
He agreed to remove the missiles from Turkey.
Okay.
But only promised to do so publicly for the removal of the missiles from Cuba.
Okay. So a public compromise and a secret agreement.
Yeah.
I can see how that would be politically expedient, but also incredibly risky.
It was a gamble, no doubt. But in the end, it worked. The Soviets began dismantling their missile sites, and the world, I think it's safe to say, breathed a collective sigh of relief. So after 13 days of living on the edge, the crisis was averted. But what about the fallout? What were the lasting impacts of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, one of the most significant outcomes, and something that you highlighted in the excerpts, was the establishment of a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow.
Oh, right.
It became known as the red telephone.
Right.
This direct line of communication between the leaders of the U.S. and the USSR.
That sounds a lot more practical than sending frantic messages back and forth through intermediaries.
Mm-hmm.
What was the thinking behind creating this hotline?
Well, I mean, the crisis had made it abundantly clear that miscommunication and delays, they could be disastrous,
Right.
especially when you're dealing with, nuclear weapons. So the hotline, it was meant to be a way to prevent future misunderstandings, to give both sides a way to communicate directly and, and de-escalate potential crises before they spiraled out of control. It was a recognition that even in the depths of the Cold War, dialogue was essential.
It's amazing to think that something positive, something that improved communication and potentially prevented future conflicts, came out of such a terrifying event.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even when the stakes are incredibly high, there's always a possibility for diplomacy to prevail.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you bring up diplomacy because the excerpts also mention that the Cuban Missile Crisis really pushed both superpowers toward pursuing arms control more seriously. Is that right?
Absolutely. Both sides had stared into the abyss of nuclear war, and I think they realized just how devastating it would be. And there was this newfound urgency to find ways to limit these incredibly destructive weapons.
So we have the hotline, we have this renewed push for arms control. Were there any other significant changes in the aftermath of the crisis?
Well, on a more, symbolic level, the crisis really underscored the global impact of the Cold War. It wasn't just a conflict between two superpowers. It was a conflict that had the potential to engulf, the entire world.
Yeah. And it brought into sharp focus, the very real human cost of this standoff.
Yeah.
We've talked about the pilots and the submarine officers caught up in the events, but ultimately it was the threat of nuclear war.
Right.
A threat that could have wiped out, millions of innocent lives that really hung over everything.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to think about the sheer scale of it all. We were talking about millions of lives literally hanging in the balance. And it wasn't just like the threat of those long-range missiles, aimed at cities.
Yeah.
The excerpts you shared, they mentioned something about like tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba.
Yeah, and this is one of the details that really, I think, drives home just how close we came to absolute disaster. It turns out the Soviets, they had actually deployed tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba as well.
Really?
Yeah, these weren't the city-busting bombs that people usually imagine when they think about nuclear weapons. These were smaller, they call them battlefield nukes, designed to be used against, troops on the ground. So even if Kennedy and Khrushchev had managed to hammer out an agreement, things could have still gone nuclear, depending on what happened on the ground in Cuba.
Exactly. And what's even more unsettling is that the local Soviet commander in Cuba, he had the authority to use those tactical nukes without waiting for approval from Moscow.
You're kidding. So there were multiple points of potential failure here, moments where one wrong decision, one miscalculation could have had unthinkable consequences.
That's right. And what we know now, thanks to, information that came out after the Cold War ended, is that there were several incidents during the crisis where the use of those tactical nukes was a very real possibility.
Like that incident with the Soviet submarine, the one where a U.S. Navy destroyer was conducting these practice depth charge runs near this Soviet submarine that, unbeknownst to them, was armed with a nuclear torpedo.
That's the one. The submarine captain, he was under incredible pressure, convinced they were under attack. He wanted to launch the torpedo, but thankfully, a senior officer on board, Vasily Arkhipov, he refused to give his authorization.
Arkhipov, wow.
Yeah.
He essentially vetoed a nuclear attack.
Yeah.
It's incredible to think that one person's decision, right, in the heat of the moment, potentially saved countless lives.
It really highlights, I think, the human element at the heart of all of this. You know, it wasn't just about abstract geopolitical maneuvering. It was about real people making decisions with unimaginable consequences.
And it really makes you question this whole idea of a victory, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis is often portrayed as this win for Kennedy in the U.S., but was it really a victory when the world came so close to total annihilation?
That's a question worth pondering for sure. We can look back now and we can see the hotline, the arms control talks, as positive outcomes, but they came at a steep price. 13 days of fear and uncertainty, where the fate of humanity quite literally hung by a thread.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought, but an important one. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Cuban Missile Crisis, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will walk away with?
I think the most crucial takeaway is just the importance of understanding history, and not just as a series of events, but as this tapestry of choices and consequences and near misses. The Cuban Missile Crisis, it reminds us that even in moments of extreme tension, diplomacy is possible.
And maybe even more importantly, it highlights the importance of clear communication, critical thinking, and the courage to choose dialogue over destruction, even when the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely. The Cuban Missile Crisis, this wasn't just a historical event. It was a stark warning. It reminds us of the fragility of peace, the ever-present danger of nuclear weapons, and the importance of, I think, constant vigilance in preventing such a crisis from ever happening again.
Well said. And listeners, you continue to, explore this pivotal moment in history.
Yeah.
Remember the individuals involved, the choices they made, and the lessons that we can learn from their experiences. The Cuban Missile Crisis, it serves as this stark reminder that the decisions we make today, the risks we take, and the lines we draw in the sand, they have the potential to shape the future of humanity.